I just want to do a quick introduction to Fred Sharpe, and I don't know if you remember this, but the first time I met Fred up in Southeast Alaska, like in the mid-1990s, and I had just gone up there on the Crusader and was with Jan Straley, who's doing some research up there, and we picked up a big 5-gallon bucket full of humpback whale poop. And I remember we were looking, Fred was up there, so we had it on our boat for a while, and I remember the smell well, and it was so bright, pink orange, and it was so beautiful. But it was just, for me, that was so exciting. And that time, that is what...
And that's one of the silent auction items.
Yes, he's been saving it all these decades. It's nice and right. But that's when I got into whales, was up in Alaska with the humpbacks initially, and I think that experience just sealed the deal, So I just am really happy to have Fred here, and we'll let him, now that we finally have the computer goddesses on our side, show his program. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for the awesome support over here in the DJ booth. Really, really appreciate it. And it's such an honor to be able to go after John, all the incredible work he's done here in the North Pacific and our understanding of whales and throughout the world. So thank you so much, John, and really appreciate that general overview about the genetics of the humpback whales. And we'll be getting to a little bit of that with my talk. And really want to thank the conference organizers, Susan and Howie. It's an honor to be back. And they've hooked us up, they've put us up in the Captain Woodby, and that's always a really great place to hang out. I remember last time I spoke here, it must have been about a decade ago, and I thought the whole conference was about drinking beers tonight at the Captain Woodby. Apparently I have to come and speak. And we had a really exciting morning down there. We're staying in the garden room, and we awoke to this rapid gunfire outside the window, and we're just like, what the heck? It's still dark out there. So we were pretty sure that SeaWorld had returned to do some more captures. And about that time, the hotel manager says, I think you guys need to go back to bed. And then a little bit later, we hear more gunfire outside the window. So we run down to the beach, and we were pretty sure that Clive Bundy and the Malheur militia had taken over the oyster beds. That time, the sheriff deputy said, yeah, you really need to go back to bed. So it's super fun to be here and share our research with you. And I would like to acknowledge my colleagues, Kenneth O'Brien, Susan Liebel, Phil Clapham, Judith Lund, and Sharon Beezer, who have been working with us on this very specific project, going back in and trying to understand whale populations using traditional ecological knowledge, whaler log books, explorer journals, as well as some of the shore-based whaling data that John alluded to. So just a little bit about the humpback whales. Wonderfully remarkable being, and it's incredibly cool to have them coming back in here into Puget Sound. I grew up here in the waters of Puget Sound, and I've spent a lot of time up in Alaska, and as beautiful as it is here, you often got the feeling that these waters were kind of empty, knowing what remarkable beings used to be here in this ecosystem, and so it's super awesome to have them coming back, and work by Cascadia and Orca Network to document this incredible recovery. And humpback whales are super amazing in that they easily identify them by the distinctive pigmentations on the underside of their tail. You can follow them through days, summers, decades, and even lifetimes. Now that we've been studying these animals long enough, we're starting to get a really good idea of their overall history. Of course, they are known for their incredibly long pectoral flippers. Megaptera, the big-winged New Englander. Humpbacks also have the very distinctive rostral knobs over the front of their body. Those are essentially repurposed whiskers, just like the ones on your cat or your dog. They now are primarily used for mechanosensory, for censoring their environment, probably through touch, other whales, prey items, maybe even density gradients in the water. And the humpbacks make the incredible sounds when they sing, of course. And what you're hearing there really is the sound of the modern ocean conservation movement. And as John mentioned, in Central California up through the mid-60s, over 2,000 humpback whales were killed, primarily for dog food and fertilizer. So we really needed a big shakeup in our consciousness and how we approach these animals, and we're very appreciative to Watlington and Roger Payne and his colleagues, and Katie Payne for bringing us the sounds of these amazing beings. Humpbacks are really cool in that they feed by using a very loud throat cavity or buccal cavity. Instead of just engulfing a single prey item, these animals will essentially engulf the entire fish school. They have the baleen plates hanging down from 2 racks on the upper roof of their mouth. They're essentially made of fingernail material. The large expandable cavity with which they take a chunk of the ocean and hopefully a bunch of prey, closing their mouth, forcing the water back through the baleen plates on either side of the mouth, and thus retaining the prey on the inside. We've also become to really appreciate that humpback whales are cognitively and probably emotionally extremely remarkably evolved beings. Some recent studies by Hoff and Vandergelt looking at the brain structure, the cytoarchitecture, the fine aspects of the human brain, has shown that they contain what are called spindle neurons. Spindle neurons are essentially like the firewire of the mammalian mind. Formerly, they were thought to be largely the exclusive domain of humans, our nearest anthropoid relatives, elephants and bottlenose dolphins, but it has been shown that humpback whales' brains are laced with these spindle neurons. Not only are they laced with them, but they occur over broader cortical areas at higher densities in our own than the human mind. We know that spindle neurons in humans are associated with language acquisition, social intelligence, facial recognition, and compassion. So it's very likely the humpback can feel all these emotions, and perhaps even in novel ways and deeper ways than we are capable of. And you see this sort of compassionate, play-like behavior. It's all over these animals. I mean, I mostly work with humpback whales, and I know not all whales are this way, but these animals truly are gentle giants. You could ask John, when we do a lot of this sort of somewhat invasive research, putting on tags or pulling these animals out of fishing gear when they're entangled, you really get to see their true nature. And they really are marvelously laid-back animals most of the time. You really see that in Hawaii a lot of the time. It's like this time of the year, the males like to cage fight. They'll get in these competitive groups. They will get 4 or 5 males that are basically beating each other up pretty good. Of course, they've lost tooth and claw. They've given it up for flipper and baleen, so they don't really seem to hurt each other most of the time all that bad. But what's remarkable is that they are so into this fighting, yet whale watch boats day after day, year after year will just go out in the water and they'll see a pod coming a couple hundred yards off and stop, and the pod will come roaring by and nobody gets killed. If you did that in front of a bull moose or almost innumerable other animals, you'd be dead. But these whales cruise right around you. They're remarkable that way. Also, their ability to interspecies play of the humpback whale. This is Mizaka's photograph, published in Bio News, showing a bottlenose dolphin riding around on the snout of a humpback whale. The bottlenose dolphin is making motorboat noises, of course. Perhaps even more amazing, John Durbin and Bob Pittman, they showed and have documented a couple times now these Weddell seals being harassed and attacked by Southern Ocean killer whales. Humpback whales show up on the scene. They run the killer whales off, roll over on their back, and let the baby seal crawl up on their tummy. So if that's not compassion, I don't know what is. And one of the things I've noticed about humpback whales is like you really learn about their compassion when you start to dip into the whaling literature. And it's something that I've never really been interested in doing, right? It's like having the pleasure and the privilege of working with these animals up in Southeast Alaska, large, recovering, ubiquitous, really accessible population. It's like my friends would give me Moby Dick and books about whaling. It's like, dude, I'm so not into that. It's like, why go to that dark place when you have these these wonderfully amazing living animals. And it's, you know how when the oxygen mask dropped from the ceiling in an airplane and they tell you to put yours on first before assisting others? That's not how the mother humpback operates. She goes to her calf first to help it when it's in distress, to her detriment, to her death, really. And the whalers figured that out right away, right? So they'd wound the calf, and that would bring the mother back in. And she typically wouldn't fight the whaler. She'd just go and embrace and just attend to her calf, and then they would wind up killing both of them. So the whaling literature is full of these tragedies, but ultimately, if you want to reconstruct what the oceans were, if we are going to have credible restoration targets, we need to know what was out there, right? And so for the last 4 years, I've been working with my study team. We've been going through whaler logbooks, explorer journals, and looking at the traditional ecological knowledge, both in Hawaii and Alaska, to look at some of these populations. The working up in Southeast Alaska is awesome because there, again, you also see the remarkable social complexity of these humpback whales. I've been interested in looking at the evolution of cooperative behavior, working with Lawrence Still at Simon Fraser University over the years. And what we see in Southeast Alaska are these large hunting pods of individuals working together as a team. They were testing notions about task specialization. The deployment of the bubble net appears to be a form of tool-using behavior. They're developing bonds that appear to last with a certain subset of whales in the group. Been looking at this question with my colleague Andy Szabo, Sean Hanser. Some of these whales in these groups will form bonds that last summers. They'll reform year after year, spanning decades, perhaps even lifetime. Some of these whales come back and work to each other. So again, we see those amazing spindle neurons at work. Humpback whales are one of the most widely distributed predators on the planet. As John mentioned, occurring into a series of what we call distinct population segments, approximately 14 worldwide. 10 of those are up for delisting from the endangered species list, which is pretty awesome, and which personally I very much support delisting. You think about the Endangered Species Act, threatened organisms, the whole intent is to help organisms that are imminent risk of extinction. And you can't argue that anymore with the humpback whale. There are species in the North Pacific that have gone extinct, marine mammals like the Steller sea cow. We have another whale in the North Pacific, the Northeast Pacific right whale, which is ready to drop off the face of the earth into extinction. They really, really need our help, and I think it's appropriate to delist the humpback whale or those of those 10 subpopulations and start to focus our efforts on some of these species that truly, truly need our help. It's awesome to study a species that goes down to the subtropics every winter. It's awesome to work in Southeast Alaska. You'd be hard-pressed to find any more beautiful place in the world. And Cynthia DeVincent and Russ Nilsson first introduced me to Southeast Alaska in 1987, and they told me on the spot, you will come back for the rest of your life. And it's true. It's such a beautiful place to work. It still feels like you're in the clutches of the last ice age. There's lots of factors that produce highly abundant and rich prey in these waters, huge tides, long daylight during the summer months, lots of rainfalls and rivers rushing in, so you get extreme nutrient inputs and primary productivity in these waters. And so the whales come in huge numbers. And it's also this, not only the abundance of prey in Alaska, and all the way actually down the inside passage to our waters. It's this pretty much of the same large oceanic gyre that produces the abundance here. And as humpbacks start to recover here and they start to return, we'll probably again to see a whole interesting diversity of dietary choices and hunting behaviors. Some of the techniques that we've used over the years to study the humpback whales, this is the research vessel Evolution. It was donated to us by Harold and Marianne Moe back in 1996. We used this vessel for over 15 years for a lot of our primary studies. We became very roving in our activities to study these remarkable bubble netting pods. We also used at Simon Fraser University some innovative techniques going into the lab and simulating predation on herring schools to test ideas about what it is about a bubble net. Is it when you have rising air, is it the mechanical, visual, or acoustic components that are able to contain fish schools? We have also been working with the Juneau Lighthouse Society. Here we are back up in Southeast Alaska, Over the last 15 years, the United States Coast Guard has very awesomely divested in their lighthouses, giving away these lighthouses to nonprofits, not only the lighthouse, but the islands that they sit on for environmental and culturally redeeming activities. The Juneau Lighthouse Association has invited us in to conduct whale research activities from this structure, which is still a functioning lighthouse. All the Coast Guard now does is to assist the National Weather Service, and they come, the aids to navigation team, they'll come and service the light bulb, but the rest of the facility is ours to upgrade. Over the years, the Lighthouse Association has done a wonderful job of bringing this facility back, making it available to us for our research activities. Of course, there's lots of marine mammals in the area. This is just sitting on the rocks. We have numerous encounters with killer whales each summer. The tower is an amazing place to hang out and watch sunsets. Humpback whales swimming by. This is Dawn Barlow. She was one of our undergraduate researchers who did her senior thesis recording up at the Lighthouse Tower. And sunny days, it's great to swim off the rocks. Right now, I'd probably not go in the water. These guys coming over, it's crazy. They'll show up. You won't even see them. You'll just be up on the helipad or up in the tower, and you'll see an orcas underwater doing this very stealthy approach, looking. We assume they're coming up to look for pupping harbor seals. Really awesome place. Great wildflowers. Another undergraduate researcher. So what we do is we use this tower to track the whales using a surveyor's theodolite. We can get very specific positioning information of where the animals are going, what their grouping is, directional heading. And by using hydrophones, both single hydrophones or work coming up the next couple of years, we're going to be switching out to hydrophone arrays so we can pinpoint where the animals are vocalizing. There's Don out deploying the hydrophone. Basically it works, you've got whales vocalizing to an anchored kayak with a hydrophone. That sends a wireless signal back up to the lighthouse. What it allows us to do is to catalog the diversity of sounds that these whales make and then correlate them with behavioral and environmental features that we're observing in these animals. So not only do we get an appreciation for what sounds the whales are making, what are the most abundant sounds in their vocal repertoire, those are the ones that are probably the most important ones to test for masking by ship noise. Because you assume with evolutionary studies, if a trait is widespread and used a lot, it's probably really important in the life of these animals. Also working with Michelle Fournay. She's a PhD student at Oregon State University. She's currently working up in Glacier Bay, but is with the National Park Service studying humpback sounds, but is also coming down to work with us at Five Finger Lighthouse. At the last Marine Mammal Conference in San Francisco in December, her work is so awesome. She was awarded the prestigious Fairfield Award for innovative marine mammal research, so we're super proud of her. Our other garrison that we have, our other facility for doing work up in Southeast Alaska, is Baranof Warm Springs. It's about 40 miles away. It's part of the town of Sitka, except we're on the other side of the island from Sitka. It's like we've got a 4,000-foot mountain range of glaciers between us and the beer store. So it is somewhat challenging, but an incredibly awesome and beautiful place to work. This facility was made available to us by some very awesome support from the former owner, Christine Lundstadt. Also want to acknowledge Mary Doherty Joe and Mary Doherty for their incredible support, allowing us to secure the down payment for this facility in this incredible glacial fjord with a giant waterfall coming in, lots of negative ions floating around for your health. Oh, did I mention that we have hot springs in this beautiful community? So, fabulous place for doing research. Lots of salmon swimming up through. Some days you can limit out on silver salmon right off the dock in front of town. Here's a salmon roasting over some coals. Doesn't that look good, darn tootin'? So there's some bears in the area, but there's plenty to go around, plenty of food to go around. There's this wonderful facility. We set up a little gift shop inside, and now we've actually gone over primarily to doing, instead of, we do some public engagement, but we're actually getting more and more interest in working with undergraduate and graduate students and making it a full-end research facility. This is Janice Straley, who we're collaborating with on a couple of different projects. One of them is the Southeast Alaska Sperm Whale Avoidance Program. Sperm whales, like humpback whales, they're showing a pretty awesome recovery in many areas. They can be problematic as these predators recover and move back into areas where they were formerly probably pretty common. Here they cause considerable grief to longliners, primarily black cod fishermen. So working with a variety of stakeholders, including the fishing industry, coming up with ways to minimize impacts to these, minimizing the depredation onto the fishermen while doing it in the most minimally invasive way, involving tagging the whales with satellite tags so we can advise the fishermen where these known depredators are. Here we are listening for sperm whales. Other studies that we're doing with the Alaska Department of Fish and Games, including monitoring, because there's hot springs there, that does allow for an increased diversity of insects and occurring in the shoulder seasons into the spring and fall, which is apparently good for bats. Also, climate change research. There's a lot of non-vegetated habitats in the area, deglaciated beaches, unusual rock types that you can actually measure succession rates on over time and gain insight into overall global warming trends. Also working with several stakeholders, including the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Coast Guard for disentanglement of whales. What's really cool about working in Southeast Alaska is that you get the sense that people are going away, because people used to live dispersed out much more widely in the environment up in Southeast Alaska. Now everything is consolidated into the cities, Juneau, Petersburg, Ketchikan, Sitka, but it used to be that people lived out widely distributed throughout the backcountry areas. Just about any bay that had a good anchorage was going to have at least one saltery and a cannery. Areas that had, here's an old gypsum mine, whaling stations distributed out the area, logging camps, fox farms. Here's another large cannery in the Bay of Pillars, and all that's going away. In fact, from the lighthouse, from the tower, you can survey nearly 80 miles of shorelines, and you don't see a single light. Other than a couple of aids to navigations, it's just a super cool, raw wilderness, and there's something about human activities, human edifices are most beautiful when they're going away. And the whales are coming back. It's super awesome. And as John alluded to, sometimes dreams come true. And when I started my work back in the late 80s, there was a lot of concern over the North Pacific humpback whale. They had been gone for over almost a century from the waters of Puget Sound in any kind of numbers, but they're showing this awesome recovery, not only here in the North Pacific, but this is a phenomena that we're seeing, essentially a worldwide phenomenon. It also, the Endangered Species Act, it inspired us to great acts of bipartisanship. So whales are awesome, how they bring people together to do the right thing. And the fact that it's a worldwide phenomenon, that you can have an upper order predator like the humpback whale show this remarkable recovery throughout much of the world's oceans, it speaks well that our sweet Gaia does have a lot of ecological resiliency, and most importantly, what it says about what we can do, not as just one individual or one organization or one country, but when a global community gets together and decides this is really important. And we've been extremely richly rewarded by these humpback whales, and we have incredible ecological challenges ahead of us. But for now, for today, for tonight, at Captain Woodby's, we're going to celebrate the recovery of humpback whales. Kindly, how are we doing for time? 20 minutes, awesome. So what's super cool about the recovery of great whales is that, things we could never imagine. In many ways, this is truly the millennium of the mysticete, because there are lots of amazing research teams and individuals studying mysticete whales right now, and just remarkable what we're learning about how important these animals are and their incredible communications abilities and what they actually mean to oceanic health. They've recently been characterized for the ecosystem services that they provide to the oceans. Not only can they structure prey communities from their top-down predation based on the types of prey that they're exploiting, but they can also have very important bottom-up effects, meaning how they can stimulate primary productivity through their fecal plumes. You can see that red area behind this animal. That's a humpback whale that's come up to the surface and defecated. Because iron and nitrogen can be important limiting nutrients in the ocean, these whales have the ability with their migratory and diving capabilities to concentrate and transport these limiting nutrients into areas, both in the water column or spatially, but in their migrations into areas that are nutrient deficient and can help stimulate primary productivity. A simple diagram works how some of these whales often are defecating up near the photic zone, where nutrients are often exhausted by the phytoplankton's growth, and then they stimulate with these fecal plumes, and you can have amazing abundances of prey. And that's one of the concerns, is that Antarctica krill is thought to have crashed. And it's because one theory is that the removal of large whales, primarily blue whales and fin whales, has just no longer allowed for these fertilization ecosystem services. It'll take a long time for ecosystems to ratchet themselves back up in amazingly counterintuitive ways that oceans can help these animals, that these oceans interact with these animals to increase primary productivity. And so we shouldn't necessarily always fear that recovering predator populations, like Yellowstone wolves, are going to have negative impacts to our human endeavors, but enrich our lives in a multitude of ways, not only aesthetics and their beauty, but also through increase of primary productivity of these oceans. So we see this really awesome enhanced biological diversity in areas where whales are recovering. Presumably we're seeing much larger aggregations of prey that transfers up through the food type. And here we see some schooling herring. And there's some evidence that marine-derived nutrients, which presumably are increasing based on the fertilization capabilities of whales, there's a couple of researchers that are testing notions that recovery of whales are actually helping terrestrial habitats as well. One of the things that you see when bears are feeding on salmon, one of the first things they do, especially the juveniles, is they grab a fish and they run up into the woods, sometimes several hundred yards from the river. Those carcasses get deposited. They can increase the amount of, again, limiting nutrients, nitrogen, micronutrients for the vegetation. That can increase the richness of insect communities. That can reverberate the food chain even into wildlife species, foraging birds, fruiting plants. And so it's remarkable what kinds of things can happen when we allow large predators to rove again free. We also know a lot about whale carcasses when they fall to the bottom of the ocean. They can form these very unique communities, cyanobacteria communities, unusual species of polychaete worms and fish that are associated with the chemical utilization of these carcasses and bones for energy. Also, it's thought that whales may even be able to save the planet. As you get increased recovery and increased primary productivity, a lot of these animals, once they fall, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. The carbon in their bodies gets locked up onto the bottom of the ocean floor. Remarkable what whales can do for us. So this gets us back to the idea of, okay, so whales are extremely important. We want to have credible restoration targets, so we want to go back into history and start looking at what was in our oceans and trying to reconstruct them using means. So what are the techniques that we use? Well, obviously using fossils. This is an amazing study that was conducted in Argentina. They built a highway through building a highway. They're actually able to uncover these areas where consistently over time, back up to 7 million years ago, they were finding areas which they attributed to harmful algal blooms where they could see a whole variety of cetaceans washing up in these large stranding events. And so if you have fossils in an area, and a good area for them to be entrained and fossilized, you can gain insight into what the historical cetaceal faunas were in a specific area. One of the things that I'm enjoying immensely is using traditional ecological knowledge, going back and seeing what place names, art objects, language references, tools, archaeological digs, and finding how humpbacks were used by indigenous people to gain insight into what marine mammals were in an area. In fact, we have some of the most interesting and deep relationships between indigenous peoples and marine mammals right here in Washington State and southern British Columbia. The macaws and the tribes in Barkley Sound who specifically specialized on utilizing humpback whales. They have amazing petroglyphs depicting these animals. Evidence suggests they've been utilizing these whales for up to 4,000 years, out hunting them, and so really remarkable spiritual systems that have evolved around utilizing these animals, presumably in a very sustainable fashion, unlike our, for many centuries, unsustainable activities. In Hawaii, sperm whales are extremely venerated. This is the sacred tooth necklace that's carved into the shape of a tongue, allowing the royalty to speak. So cultural methods can really help you to understand also what has been in our ancient oceans. Now, John showed you this picture. This was data from the Splash Project. What's really intriguing, if you look at this, is you'll notice that Southeast Alaska and Hawaii show, unlike all other global populations, they are showing evidence that the population is bottlenecked. And in fact, a very low diversity, or perhaps maybe even down to just one or a few maternal lineages, form this population of well over 10,000 animals now that moves between Hawaii and Alaska, and perhaps some of these whales that are out here. According to Mark Mallison, they found at least 4 whales that are right out here that appear to be Hawaiian animals. You'll note their breath smells like pineapples. But the important thing is this human caused? Is this bottleneck, can it be attributed to human agencies? Well, it's a really interesting paper that was published by Louis Herman. He works at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. And he was a really cool guy because he was asking some really amazing questions long before traditional ecological knowledge and historical ecology became vogue in the conservation literature. He was asking questions about the history of humpback whale populations, kind of before ahead of his times, really awesome. And he came to the conclusion that based on the absence of humpback whales in a variety of sources, he felt humpback whales were new to Hawaii and had colonized the islands only within the last 200 years, which kind of fits with John's finding of this apparently bottleneck population that moves between Alaska and Hawaii. Very intriguing. Lou Herman proposed that humpback whales were unknown to ancient Hawaiians based on their lack of cultural representations. There didn't appear to be any references to them in explorer journals, no references to sperm whales either, which he felt were only occasionally exploited and very uncommon around the Hawaiian Islands historically. Lou Herman also noted a lack of references to dolphins in Hawaiian art and art representations and cultural languages, so he also felt that many species of dolphins weren't using the Hawaiian Islands. And so when I went down there to start spending my winters down there 4 years ago, I was like, what? It just didn't seem to add up, right? It just seemed, how can Hawaii, which has such an abundance of cetaceans that Robert Baird and other Cascadia researchers have been documenting, there really is an incredible diversity of cetaceans there, some of the highest diversities anywhere. About half the species appear to show unusual forms of island associatedness, so it just didn't add up that there was this pervasive idea that humpback whales were new to the Hawaiian Islands. So with the study team that we had assembled, we also noted that it was real common to think that humpback whales were not only not harvested by the whalers, but despite there being hundreds of whale ships that visited the Hawaiian Islands each winter, there was a thought that the whalers weren't taking them. So it was just like, it just all seemed really unusual and bizarre. So we started going through reading Lou's paper very carefully, trying to formally test some of the hypotheses. And basically what he proposed was that humpback whales moved into the Hawaiian Islands to escape whaling pressure along the Asiatic coast starting in the 1600s. Here we see the North Pacific and the whales coming over from the Asian areas to utilize the Hawaiian Islands, one of the most isolated island groups on the entire planet. And what's really cool, in discussions with John, he maintains that actually it's possible that the individuals that colonized Hawaii show a closer affinity to Mexican or Central American humpbacks. So we kept testing these ideas. Lou Herman also suggested that the waters may seasonally be sea surface temperatures during periods of El Nino or southern oscillation events may be unsuitable for humpback whales. So we're also testing ideas about that. Our primary source of literature, in addition to the traditional knowledge, is going back into whaler logbooks. And what we have been able to show is that actually there's a pretty good evidence that humpback whales may have been there for a long time. By going in and plotting the density of kills of these animals, this is the 19th century, 1820 through 1880. Blue represents sperm whale kills, red represents humpback whale kills. We've actually been able to show actually there was intensive whaling occurring in the Hawaiian Islands. There we can see the green, again showing humpback whale kills. Red is fin whales. A lot of fin whales were sighted, not necessarily taken, but sighted early on. Here we see plotting the animals. Blue represents sperm, red fin, and green humpback whales. And it's kind of weird. You'll notice it didn't appear to be, this is the Nantucket fleet, that the early data set that Lou Herman used. No kills in the Hawaiian Islands. So you can kind of see where he was like, God, it doesn't seem like humpback whales used to be there. Well, we started working with Susan Lebo and Judith Lund, and looking at the data from a local shore stations and the local whaling fleet, and it turns out they were taking lots of humpback whales. It just wasn't making it back into that data set that Lou Herman had looked at. Here we see, using logbook data, 19th century humpback whale kills, seasonal distribution, June to June. We can also not only see if whales used to be in these areas, but gain insight into what their seasonal distribution was. You can see the peak of the animals here, January to April, very closely matching the modern distribution. So it's really cool to see humpbacks re-owning, not only spatially, but temporally, their former habitats. My favorite part, though, has been using traditional ecological knowledge, going back to these fish heiaus temples that were in reverence to the ocean's productivity. National Marine Fisheries Service deserves huge credit for lots of reasons for their incredible work, not only for managing the Marine Mammal Protection Act and portions of the Endangered Species Act, but also their excellent cultural information that they've done. They produced this brochure, The Cultural Significance of Whales in Hawaii, and they show there's actually lots of references to, ancient references to humpback whales. It's called the kohola in the Hawaiian language. Minnie Winfield's reference to they're called winds of the leaping whale. That sure sounds like a humpback whale if I know it. Also, oil is the kukui nut transference with means the same thing as whale oil. And if you start to look or go carefully around the islands, you see there's actually lots of references to not only humpback whales, but also sperm whales. Spirit guardian is thought to be the, sandalwood is thought to be the spirit guardian of the sperm whale. In the trophic ecologies and spirituality of the humpback whales, they correctly predicted that if the sandalwood disappeared, so would the sperm whales. In fact, that was the first major product of the Hawaiian Islands. The forests were devastated by the sandalwood traders. A few decades later, sperm whales disappeared. Go figure, brilliance. So I just want to finish up here by saying that it's really important to look deeply and widely when you're trying to reconstruct ancient populations of whales. And this is one of the first times that we presented this data, so it's been a super honor to come before you and reflect on these amazing animals. If we have time, I'll answer a few questions. Otherwise, come out tonight for a few beers at Captain Woodby's. Thank you so much. Question right here. Who is some of the main individuals who are decoding the humpback whale dialect? Great question. And that's one of the cool things about humpback whales is that they have a very nearshore distribution throughout much of their range. And so it's allowed many different research teams to look at these humpback whales. Rebecca Dunlop and Michael Node's group in Australia, they're doing fantastic work. Alison Stimpert, My colleague, Michelle Fournay, we've been very interested in looking at humpback whale dialects. Of course, Roger Payne is doing fantastic work. Jim Darling, he just published an awesome paper on very low frequency sounds that come from humpback whales. Adam Pack, the list goes on and on. Check with me later, we'll get you a reading list. Way up in the back.
That's a great question concerning the fin whale. John, can you
answer that? There's
John in the back.
I couldn't quite hear the question.
Concerning the recent exciting sighting concerning the fin whale and what their prospect is for recovery, and if they are actually formally present in our inland waters.
Yes, and I think like humpback whales, sperm whales have been increasing, not quite as fast, but about 3% a year. And they certainly are showing up in many areas where they've gone as whales. So I think it's something similar to humpback whales, but occurring a little more slowly.
All right. Saying that fin whales are recovering at a slower rate, but also showing the potential for recovery.
In local waters. Let's hear it for the fin whales. Yeah. Right here, question? Question right here.
Actually walking with for millions of years or something. Is that accurate?
Did spindle whales evolve before they spindle neurons, they evolved in cetaceans millions of years before they occurred in humans. And it stands to reason that they did, that they actually had these abilities to evolve these sophisticated abilities for communication, for thought, for individual recognition. And you look how incredibly complex the humpback whales' vocalizations are. We've identified at least 8 different types of sounds, maybe up to as many as 16, similar to other researchers looking at social sounds. They're incredibly elaborate songs that you get the feeling that they can probably recognize dozens, if not hundreds of different individuals.
A lot of things that seem kind of inexplicable in these whales suggest that they have huge abilities for individual recognition. When we hear them singing, we don't necessarily see a lot of approaching each other's and following up. It's probably because they can recognize a huge panoply of other whales out there. And the fact that they probably have had spindle neurons for millions of years before us gave them incredible capabilities to develop cultural complexity. We also know that they've had the internet for long before us. What's really cool is that if you look at Hawaii, Mexico, and Japan, they share a lot of song similarities, suggesting they're in acoustic contact over thousands of miles. Garland's and her colleagues in Oceania, they've shown these cultural ripples, these song themes that radiate outwards. It can take a couple years to travel across the Pacific Ocean, but it's amazing to think their acoustic capabilities as populations increase and there's more conductivity. I mean, who knows how these oceans transferred information prior to the devastation wrought by humans. And so what an exciting time to be in communication theory.
Saying about having individual tones. So do humpbacks have like regional dialects in the same way that orcas do?
Do humpback whales have regional dialects in the same way that killer whales do? That's a really great question, and one that a question we're working on with Michelle Fournay and our study team. We're collaborating with other researchers around the planet to compare social sounds and to see how similar they are between different, presumably culturally and reproductively isolated populations. And there does appear to be a lot of similarity between different populations, but there's also perhaps some nuances. You would expect there to be some cultural variation and some cultural dialects, right? Song's a little bit harder to track down because it's such a dynamic, rapidly evolving entity that it seems to be much more plastic, but we kind of feel like social sounds are the Rosetta Stone of the humpback whale, so almost more like jabber almost more language-like characteristics. And one thing that's really cool about humpback whales is that they vocalize totally within our frequency domain. Almost all their energy is between our 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz hearing range. Their song has elements of syntax and rhyme. It constantly evolves in very similar language-like attributes. And no way are we saying that it is language, but we do know that the tools that we've developed for human speech analysis work awesomely with humpback whales. So it's pretty exciting, and check back in a couple of years and we'll have a better idea about the cultural nuances between subpopulations, but a great question. Right there, blue hat. Good question. There's not a lot of evidence that when a humpback whale is vocalizing, we assume it's kind of like birdsong. We assume it's a sexually selected behavior. We know that pretty much only males, as far as we know, produce the song. Presumably, the targets are other females, and it's stimulating the preference genes of the female, so she can come over and make a good choice, mate with the most vigorous male, and both the male traits and the female traits eventually come to numerical dominance in a population based on good reproductive decisions, little classic little evolutionary loop there. But the cool about a thing is that we don't see a lot of females, just in your classic vocalizing male, and then the females coming over and mating. I think it has to do, again, it gets back to this thing about having spindle neurons, is that females they're probably, as they head towards Hawaii, they're probably picking up fragments of song a couple hundred miles out, right? And they're cruising in, and they hear that one really nice crooner, and it's like, yeah, maybe I'll hook up with that dude in the nightclub, a little later on in the breeding season, right? And so she doesn't need to run to the male. We know that the sex ratio on the breeding grounds is typically 3 males to 1 female. And so there's she can be really coy and really choosy, and she often has a male escort with her, and we know very little about what her estrus window is, but she probably can just, for want of a better word, she just waits for the right moment to put herself in the path of one of these whales, or sets herself up and lets the guys duke it out. And so because she probably has the ability to recognize dozens, if not hundreds, of these males within a reproductive milieu, it's like she's in no hurry. And so I think it's probably still occurring that there is components of female choice in the song. Also, the combative mating, the competitive heat runs, the competitive groups with the primary escort. The songs may also be used between the males, has been suggested by Dim Darling, to form temporary coalitions to overcome other primary escorts, and so possibly a lot of different targets and a greater theater of complexity than we realize. Is there a lot of difference between northern and southern hemisphere and how they migrate? I would say overall, I'm an evolutionary biologist. We tend to look for similarities, for heritable similarities. We put more emphasis on genetic attributes as opposed to cultural attributes. So I would argue that humpback whales worldwide are very similar overall. There might be localized dialects or different areas or length of the migrations or time of the migrations, but overall I think humpback whales show a wonderfully remarkable similarity between subpopulations, even though we have genetic evidence that they've been separated by over, in some cases up over 100,000 years. That's why it's so cool to hear about what John's saying about how there's apparently humpback whales moving between the northern and southern hemisphere based on their genetic signature. And Susan is kindly saying that it's time for me to wrap it up. And so save your questions for Captain Woodley and Beers. Thanks again.